Primer, Episode 2, Places, Peoples, and Cultures of Essos and the Other Continents. Part 8, The Elephants of Volantis. Of all the 9 free cities, the biggest, baddest, richest of them all are Braavos and Volantis, and they happen to be polar opposites. Braavos is the northernmost free city, and Volantis is the most southern. Braavos was founded by escaped slaves yearning for freedom and fighting to stop slavery wherever they could. Volantis, on the other hand, is so heavily involved in slavery, it's said that the city was built on the backs of 1 million slaves. And it's a well-known fact that there are 5 slaves for every 1 free person here. Braavos has a nearly unstoppable navy, and volunteering slave armies are amongst the best ground fighters in the world. But we're not here to talk about Braavos. No, this video is covering Volantis, the southernmost of all the free cities. Volantis was originally founded as a Valyrian military outpost in its earliest days, but due to its dope-ass location at the spot where the Rhoyne River flows into the Summer Sea with an excellent natural harbor, this city quickly expanded to a center of trade and commerce. Pretty soon, the Dragon Lords of Valyria realized that they needed to protect this new investment, so they built these massive, seamless walls of fused black stone so thick that you could sit 6 chariots with 4 horses each, side by side, on top of the wall. In fact, every year they do just that. They have a chariot race, Ben-Hur styles, to commemorate the founding of the city. Only imagine that chariot race on top of a 200-foot-high wall. Craziness. Over time, as the city grew rich and powerful, noble families of Valyria chose to resettle in Volantis. Those pure-blooded Valyrians would live inside the black walls of the city, while the poor people and anyone who happened to be non-pure-blooded lived outside the walls. These Volantine nobles are really serious about the purity of their Valyrian blood, much like the followers of Voldemort from the Harry Potter books. They're so into this segregation that they will literally not even allow people who are not Valyrian to enter the Black Walls unless they have the express invitation of one of the Valyrian nobles. And Volantis didn't just grow rich over time, it also grew in size. When the Valyrians erected their walled city, they only built it on one side of the river. On the opposite shore, another settlement grew up that was so lawless and dangerous that the Triarchs, the rulers of Volantis, decided to build a giant bridge across the mighty river so that they could rule that other settlement too and make sure it was kept in check. 40 years and millions of gold pieces later, the long bridge of Volantis was completed and became the longest bridge in the world. It's so big, it's said to be able to hold 1,000 elephants and is one of the wonders of the world. It's so wide that they were able to build shops and houses on either side of the bridge with a huge road in between, which was large enough for 2 carts to pass by each other. Okay, I'm about to take a little bit of a tangential side trip from our history of Volantis because I want to take a moment to point out something that I believe the HBO TV show got wrong. You guys remember Robb Stark? Of course you do. Well, remember how he married this chick named Talisa instead of one of Walder Frey's daughters? Let's talk about Talisa for a second. She's supposed to be from Volantis, and her last name, at least according to the official Game of Thrones wiki, is Maegir, and she's from an old, rich family of Volantis. One of the Triarchs of Volantis is named Malakwo Maegir. It's never said whether Talisa is related to Malakwo, but if she is, and I suspect she's supposed to be something like that, because George R. R. Martin gave the HBO guys that name, but if she is related to him, then that means she's from one of the richest and most powerful families, not just in Volantis, but in the world. That also means she must be a Valyrian. So she should look more like Daenerys than an olive-skinned Dornish woman. I think I know why the showrunners didn't give the actress Una Chaplin a white wig, though, like a white-haired wig. I think it was because they didn't want to confuse the audience, because if Talisa looked like Daenerys and Viserys, people might think she was secretly related to the Targaryens, which I guess in an indirect, roundabout kind of way, a girl like Talisa would be because they're all Valyrians. But it's kind of a moot point, I guess, because for one thing, she's not a character from the books, and for another thing, she's dead, and doesn't technically have any effect on our current story. Anyway, that was just me being nitpicky. Let's get back to our discussion about the Free Cities. Like all the other Free Cities, well, except Norvos and Qohor, Volantis doesn't have one official religion. Temples of many different faiths can be found outside the black walls where the nobility live. The largest and most influential of all these religions is the faith of R'hllor, the Red God, or the Lord of Light. In the HBO show, we just met the show's version of the High Priest of Volantis in Season 6. In the books, this character is a man named Benaro, but in the TV show, it's a High Priestess, a woman named Kinvara. Behind the black walls where the nobility lives, however, it's a different story. The nobles of Volantis, these old Valyrian families, worship gods from old Valyria, as you might imagine. Again, we're talking about Valyrian gods knowing that the freehold itself was atheistic. But since we know that Lorath, Norvos, and Qohor are all Valyrian colonies founded by religious sects, then we know that the Valyrians must have had gods or a religion of some kind, even if it wasn't officially sanctioned or maybe even openly practiced. Now, the nobility doesn't just live behind black walls. They also are responsible for electing 3 officials to rule over the city, and these rulers are called the 3 Triarchs of Volantis. The elections are ultra-competitive, 10-day-long events that happen every year. It's a sort of democratic process where both men and women vote for who they think would be good for the city. Or at least noble men and women get a chance to vote. People who weren't fancy lords and ladies didn't get a voice in these matters at all, even if they were wealthy. Wealth does not equal power in Volantis. Purity of blood is the most important thing. Which again makes me think that the TV show got it wrong when they made Robb's wife Talisa look like she was Dornish or something. A noble family of Valyria, like hers, would have been fanatical about preserving their white-haired, blue or purple-eyed features. Like I said before, I guess it doesn't really matter, but it nagged at me anyway. So after all this talk about the nobles of Volantis, if you're getting the impression that these people are snobs who think that they're better than everyone else, then I'm doing my job properly, because that's what they're like. When the doom struck Valyria and that whole peninsula, Volantis sought to fill the power vacuum that the Dragon Lords left behind. They have tried over and over again to subjugate the other free cities and re-establish a new freehold of sorts, with their city as the capital. In the century of blood that followed the doom of Valyria, Volantis attempted to subject its sister cities to hostile takeovers. But none of these schemes pan out in the long run, and while the Volantines succeed in conquering some of the other free cities, they could never hold on to power because of all the infighting between factions of powerful families within Volantis itself. These 2 factions were known as the Tigers and the Elephants. The Tigers were the people who always wanted to go to war and dominate that part of the world, and the Elephants sought to grow the power and wealth of the city through trade and money as opposed to war and conquest. Eventually, the Elephant faction won the day, and now Volantis is super rich, but not very aggressive, towards its neighboring cities. One of the most interesting things to me anyway about Volantis is that most of the city is actually empty. At least the part of the city behind the black walls, that is. Back in the day, during the height of the Valyrian freehold, the city of Volantis was packed. The people who lived in the peninsula would frequently visit or stay for a few years to set up businesses. These fancy, rich Valyrians wanted to live in the same opulence they had back home in Valyria, and so they built stunning villas and pleasure gardens behind those black walls. But then the doom happened, and anyone who was on the peninsula at that moment died, probably horrifically. After the doom, the population of Volantis dropped without the Valyrian tourist traffic. Plus, the side effect of a bunch of dead Valyrians is that there are now less white-haired, pure-blooded Valyrians out in the world for the snobby elites of Volantis to marry. So, over the centuries since then, the population of purebloods who live behind the black walls has really dwindled. Finally, let's try and figure out what real-life city George R. R. Martin might have been inspired by when he was dreaming up Volantis. Well, this whole time that we've been doing this whole comparison with real-life places, we've been comparing Valyria to Rome and the freehold to the Roman Empire. So if we go with that analogy, then the best fit for Volantis would be real-life Constantinople. So for those of you who don't know, Constantinople is the ancient name of the city of Istanbul in Turkey today. Constantinople was actually founded by the Romans because one of the emperors thought that the empire in fact needed two people to rule it from two separate capitals. So there was a time in the Roman Empire where it was ruled by the Emperor of the West, based out of Rome, and the Emperor of the East, based out of Constantinople. Eventually, Rome fell, and Constantinople was left as the only capital of the former Roman Empire. That is kinda sort of what Volantis' relationship with the city of Valyria and the freehold in general was like. It wasn't an alternate capital like Constantinople, but it was the largest city that the Valyrians built outside of the peninsula. So when Valyria fell, when the doom happened, that left Volantis as the last and greatest of Valyria's former colony cities. And to this point in the story, it's possibly the largest city on the continent of Essos outside of Lynn, the capital of the Golden Empire of Yi. And if it's largest city in Essos, it's definitely many times bigger than even the largest cities combined on Westeros. The similarities between Volantis and Constantinople don't stop there. Constantinople was strategically situated on the mouth of the Bosporus River and the Black Sea, and the Marmara Sea and the Aegean Sea. And I said at the top of the Volantis discussion, the fantasy city was built on the mouth of the Rhine River where it meets the Summer Sea. Both are therefore excellent natural harbors. And bridges across the Bosphorus River were amongst the longest and widest bridges in the ancient world. Same with the infamous Long Bridge of Volantis, which is the longest bridge in all of Planetos. There's also the fact that Volantis deals with constant threats from the Dothraki, a nomadic warrior people from a great stepped plain or grassland. Constantinople also faced its fair share of threats from nomadic warrior tribes of the Central Asian steppes. Finally, the city of Constantinople was famous for its incredible fortifications. The inner walls of the city were about 6 meters thick and about 12 meters high. And I told you before, the city walls of Volantis are so thick that you can race chariots across the top. And just like the real-world inspiration city of Constantinople after Rome fell, the city of Volantis attempted to subjugate its sister cities in the century that followed the doom of Valyria. As I said earlier, Volantis was a major aggressor during the Century of Blood. And that brings us to the end of our discussion on the city of Volantis. Up next, we're going to take a look at Volantis' greatest rival amongst the free cities.